in a post-pandemic world, it's been easy, hasn't it, over the last year for us to really get quite kind of focused in on ourselves, on what's going on with us and our little bit of the world and our lives. And really this series is a way of saying, let's lift our eyes again. Let's lift our eyes up and let's lift our eyes out to see actually what God is doing all around the world and what God has been doing through the centuries. That's all these things are really doing. They're helping us to say, listen, despite everything that's going on in our world and has gone on, God is still on his throne. He still works in powerful ways down through the centuries, across the globe. God is at work, and we can take great comfort from that in the midst of our own circumstances. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to talk just for 15 minutes, don't laugh, and about Adoniram Judson, and then we're going to watch a 10-minute interview about the man's kind of legacy. And we're going to see some people talk about that a bit later. Now, Adoniram Judson, who is he? Well, in some sense, he's famous for being the first American missionary that was sent overseas. He was the first person that ever went. He was born in 1788, he died in 1850, and he went to a place in the world called Burma, or what is today called Myanmar. And if I keep switching between the two, it's because I've been reading a slightly older biography, and my mind keeps flitting between the two names. If you want to read the biography, you can take mine home, you can kind of alco wipe it or whatever and return it whenever, if you want to find out some more about Adoniram Judson. So what is there to say about him? Well, he was born in 1788 in a place called Malden, not Malden, Bedfordshire, Malden, Massachusetts. And he grew up, and he was clearly a really bright kid. He was kind of intellectually just incredibly sharp. In fact, he went to uni, or the equivalent of uni, when he was 16. And everyone around could see how bright and how smart he was, and he progressed quick, and he met a mate. His new kind of best mate forever was a guy called Jacob Eames, and they both had these ambitions. They wanted to be wealthy, they wanted to be successful, they wanted to go into law and politics. They had these ambitions. Now, Judson had come from a Christian home, but when he went to college, his new friend Jacob Eames was kind of a philosophical skeptic. That means the kind of view that you really sort of doubt everything. There's no such thing as absolute truth. Really, just doubt everything. And Judson bought into all of this. He became a skeptic. After college, he returned home and he told his parents about his newfound philosophy. They were heartbroken. And his intent was to go and travel across America. He joined a theatrical group in New York, and he traveled the country with this group. It seems he was a bit of a lad. He says of himself at one point, he says that we lived a reckless, vagabond life, finding lodgings wherever we could. We'd find a landlord, we'd run up a score, and then we'd decamp without paying. This was the kind of guy he was and the kind of people he was moving with. Seems at some point he ran into trouble and he had to return home. And on his journey home, a momentous thing happened. He stopped off at a lodge somewhere to stay, and the landlord said, you're welcome to the room, but I just need to apologize because in the next room we've got a young man. He's gravely ill, and we think he may die in the night. Adoniram Judson, he lay there all night listening to the groanings of the guy in the next room, and his mind couldn't help it. He was just thinking, what about this guy? What's going to happen to him? Does he have any faith? Do I have any faith? What would happen to me? The next morning, he asked the man after. He asked the landlord of the lodge. He said, look, what happened to the young man? He said, he died in the night. He said, did you know who he was? He said, yes, his name was Jacob Eames. It was his best friend from college who had died in the night. It caused just a crisis of his own sort of faith. And he went home and he started exploring. He was desperate for answers. He started talking to his family, talking to friends of his family. He even enrolled in Bible college to see if he could find out whether Christianity was true. That's not normally the way you do it. You normally enroll in Bible college because you want to train for ministry. He enrolled because he wanted to find out if Christianity was true. Seems he had his questions answered. And just before his 21st birthday, he devoted himself to Jesus. He became a Christian. His zeal kind of spilled over into this Christian life, and within a couple of years he was committed. So I want to go overseas. I want to go to the mission field. I want to go and take this news about Jesus to those that have never heard. And he started talking to people, finding out where there was need. And he settled on going to the Far East. He settled on Asia. And in particular, he wanted to go to Burma or to Myanmar. And he basically got the approval. And his plan was set. He's 25 years old. In February 1812. He marries a girl called Anne Hazeltine, and then 5 days later whisks her off for a romantic honeymoon as they set sail for India. It takes 4 months. It's a 4-month journey. It's not just you can't just go on a plane. 4-month journey on a boat. It was pretty unpleasant. They got to India. They stayed there for a year just with kind of the British missionaries. They were trying to find out a little bit about the culture, find out about the opportunities. And then the following year, in 1813, they set sail for Burma. And the first thing they had to do was that they immediately had to start learning the language. In some ways, the language is the most difficult thing. Now, there's a few, just a few little pics I want to show you, if we can get those up. So there's a picture of Judson himself. You can see he looks like a fun kind of guy. That's him as a slightly older man in his late 40s. If you have the next picture, you can see where he went. Next slide. There you go. You can see Burma just there between India and China. And then the next picture is the Burmese alphabet. So if we can go to that. So that's what he's got to learn. There's no kind of online courses. We can lose the picture now. Thank you. There's no real teachers. There's really very little in the way of books. There's no Duolingo app. Adoniram and Anne just had to set to work of just trying to learn this language. In fact, it took them 3 years just to begin to feel like they were getting a handle on the language. Judson was passionate about translating the scriptures into the Burmese language. So he started with Matthew's Gospel. He thought, if I can start working on this, if I can get the language, then we can start, showing people this thing. After they'd been 4 years, they started to have very gentle conversations with people about religion. Now, at that time, in Burma, there was a death sentence. You could be sentenced to death if you converted from the national religion, which was Buddhism. So it was a pretty serious thing. They couldn't just start services. They couldn't just start talking to people about Jesus. They had to kind of tread very carefully, very gently. In 1819, after they'd been there 6 years, they saw their first converts. That's quite a staggering thing, isn't it? Can you imagine devoting yourself to this work, going through all the hardship of getting there, traveling, learning the language? It takes 6 years to see one convert. 3 years later, by 1822, they'd got 18, but they've been there like 9 years, and there's 18 people. Not all of them seem that rock solid, but this is where they're at. And in 1824, something interesting happens. It's kind of one of those weird things, the weird ways in which God works, which you think doesn't look that great, but God used him. And what happened was the British invaded. The British were seeking to expand their trade routes in the region, and they invaded Burma. Now, at that time, that meant that any foreign nationals, any English-speaking foreign nationals were considered spies. So Judson and some friends were arrested. He was put in prison as a spy. He spent almost 2 years in jail. He was starved. He was beaten. He would quite often spend the night hung upside down from his ankles with just his shoulders touching the floor. He nearly died in prison, but eventually, after almost 2 years, he got out. And interestingly, if there's any upside to the British success, it was now that they were free to talk about religion. They were free to talk about Christianity. They were free to hold services, and Burmese nationals were free to find out and convert if they wanted. So Judson keeps working. He begins to write, to translate more of the Bible. He eventually gets the New Testament done. He writes basics of the Christian faith documents. He writes little services. He writes little handbooks for pastors. And then remarkably, he sees something of an explosion. Between 1828 and 1831, so this is just kind of 10 years later, they'd seen 350 converts. They managed to get the New Testament printed and get 3,000 of them distributed. By 1834, a few years later, it also finished the Old Testament. And so the first ever complete version of the Burmese Bible was born. By the time it actually got it printed, He'd been working on it for almost 22 years. Okay, it's just worth noting the timescales, isn't it? Nothing happened quickly. It took 6 years to see one convert, and by 22 years, they'd seen quite a few more, and they'd got the Burmese Bible kind of translated, but it took 22 years of unbelievable graft to get this thing printed. Now, if we're learning about Judson's life, there's a couple of things that are worth noting. One is he definitely had a slightly excessive tendency to him. He said this at one point in his life. He said, look, I think Christians should withdraw 7 times a day to pray, be content with the plainest diet, to fast often, to dress in coarse, poor apparel, to discard all finery, occupy a poor habitation, allow no amusements, get rid of the encumbrance of worldly property. And he believed that with enough effort, perfect sanctification, perfect holiness was attainable in this life. At points, he's almost monastic in his zeal. He definitely has this kind of excessive tendency, which in many ways actually was slightly unhealthy. We're going to see in a minute some of the sickness suffered by him and his family. Some of that was partly due to his absolute refusal to leave the mission field. It seems like when grief struck him, he sort of buried it with a kind of workaholism. Now, the reason I tell you that is to say, just beware of idolizing these people. Some biographies of missionaries, you read them and they're just thoroughly discouraging because you think, I could never be like that person. They're a super saint. And actually, as you look at these people, they had their own significant flaws. They were far from perfect. Judson was not a perfect person. He definitely had his own quirks and excessive tendencies and things that he did that I think we'd question. He was used greatly of God, but really because of God's greatness as much as Judson's. We shouldn't idolize these people. They should encourage us and challenge us and inspire us. But we shouldn't put them on pedestals as if they were in a sort of a league of their own super saints. They really weren't. The other thing that we have to say about Judson is if you're going to learn about Adoniram Judson, you have to note the amount of tragedy in his life. You have to know what he went through in his work. He had a constant battle with ill health. It seems almost every year of his work, there was some sort of serious illness or worse. On their journey from India to Burma, they had found out that Anne was pregnant with their first child. And during that voyage, Anne went into labor and miscarried their first child. 2 years later, 1815, the Judsons lost their second child, a boy called Roger, aged 8 months, of fever. In 1826, less than a year after Judson had been released from prison, Anne herself became sick, and she died. She was just 36 years old. To make it worse, 6 months later, their third child, Maria, died aged just 2. In 1835, Judson married again a lady called Sarah Boardman. She'd been a widow of a fellow missionary. They had 8 children between them, 3 of whom died in their first 2 years of life. Sarah herself got sick and died aged just 42. In 1846, he married a lady called Emily. It was a bit of a scandal because she wasn't really seen as a particularly serious Christian. She was known for being a poet and an artist. And at the time of their marriage, he was 57, she was 29. A lot of people wondered what was going on. But 4 years after this, Judson himself became sick. He was prescribed a sea voyage. They seem to think sea voyages fixed everything then. He went on a sea voyage, but he didn't get better. And on April the 12th, 1850, Judson himself died aged 61. 10 days after Judson's death, before the news had reached his wife Emily, she gave birth to their son Charles, who was stillborn. Can you imagine that weight of grief in her life? He'd lost 2 wives and 7 children, as well as probably dying younger than he could have done himself because of what he put himself through. It's an astonishing thing to imagine having to endure, isn't it? Different times, different places. They didn't have the resources and the healthcare we had. The loss is just hard to imagine. By the time of Judson's death, he'd been on the mission field for almost 40 years in Burma. He had completed his Burmese translation of the Bible, and by the time he died, there were 100 churches with 8,000 Christians. In the last 150 years, that's actually grown 50-fold, as we're going to hear in a few moments. But before we hear that interview, let me just give you a few applications I think are worth pondering as we just take that little snapshot of Adoniram Judson's life. And the first one is this. Notice his powerful devotion to his sense of God's call on his life. This wasn't a short-term fix. It wasn't a phase. It wasn't a stepping stone to something else. He was serious about the call he felt God had given him. We often think, don't we, that the grass is greener somewhere else, that somewhere else will be easier or we'll be happier. I don't know, maybe Judson thought like that, but it doesn't look like it. He believed that God had called him to a place. Now, we want to say, don't we, that we believe actually that all of us are called by God. All of us are on mission for God. Mission is not just the reserve of people who go overseas. All of us are called in different ways, different places to God. And it's things like that sense of God has called me to this place. How do I glorify God? How do I seek to love God and love my neighbour in the place, or actually the places where God has put me? Has this powerful sense of call. Second thing is he has a real seriousness about mission and holiness and prayer. He has an excessive tendency, that's true. But as I read his story, I'm challenged by his real sense of actually holiness is serious. Prayer is critical. Mission is absolutely crucial. He is deeply serious about living for God in every way and at every opportunity, in a way that I think many of us actually probably aren't. Third little application is this. It's a marathon, not a sprint. It took him 6 years to see one convert. It took 22 years of work to translate the Bible. He was in Burma for 40 years. The call that God gives us, it's a long-term thing, isn't it? It's not just a go and do something for 5 minutes, change the world and go and do something else. No, look, Christian life, Christian mission is long-term. It is often fairly undramatic and unspectacular. But it's exactly this that God seems to use and bless. Fourth thing, there's just two more. God can do and is doing amazing work through ordinary people. What's interesting is when the kind of the British invasion happens and things open up, most of the work, certainly in terms of establishing churches, isn't done by Judson. It's done by the Burmese people. He meets people and he encourages them, and he has impact through his writing and his teaching. But actually, most of the pastors that go and start churches in different places and set up these churches, they're just the ordinary people. No one writes biographies about them, but actually it was them that God used. Yeah, Judson was a catalyst. But God did amazing things through just very ordinary people. People who didn't have Judson's intellect, people who didn't have a university or a college education, just people who wanted to live for Jesus. And as an aggregate, we use greatly of God's. Here's the last thing before we watch the video, is that it's a reminder. It's a reminder to lift our eyes, to be thankful and hopeful and prayerful and devoted. As we look around our world, we look at our lives, we look at what we've been through in the last year and what we're coming out of it, it just reminds us that God is at work. God is still on his throne. He's still doing amazing things, just as he has done through the millennia, across the globe. God is at work, and that gives us strength and comfort. So whatever situation we're in, God calls us and God uses us in simple, small, and ordinary ways as he sees fit to glorify his name.